Hello everybody, welcome to Brandon's Haunted Library. My name is Brandon, your undead librarian, and I read and talk about fantasy, literary fiction, and of course, horror. Thank you for choosing my video. Hope you stick around because today I'll be talking about everything I read this August. It was a busy month, but I spent a lot of my free time reading. I read 7 books this month, some science fiction horror, some psychological horror, epic fantasy, and a couple great newly released literary fiction novels that I'm excited to tell you about. So I'll talk about each in order of my favorite from the month, so stick around for the end if you want to hear about my favorite. So I'll start off now with my least favorite of the month, Edgedancer by Brandon Sanderson. This was just okay. It was a bit of a chore for me to read this novella as part of the Stormlight Archives. It's meant to be read after the second book, Words of Radiance, which was a book I absolutely loved. I adored that one. The ending got me super excited to move on to book 3, Oathbringer, but instead this nearly 300-page novella picks up from one of the pretty forgettable interludes from Words of Radiance, which introduced a new character, Lift. Now, from how it seems, she's likely to play a larger role as this epic series progresses. She returns in Oathbringer and has had some impact in that story and is a great addition to the cast of characters, I will definitely say that, but this story just didn't do much for me. This book serves to fully introduce Lift, introduce her magic system, which, props to Brandon Sanderson, is something he always does a great job of doing, but to me this kind of feels like a comedic side quest, but the humor fell flat. And because of the length, it was a bit of a slog to finish, and it made me lose some of the momentum that was built from the ends of Word of Radiance. But it did make me like the character a lot, but in the end I gave this book 2.5 stars. I felt like this could have been half as long and I would have enjoyed it more. If you're reading Stormlight, I don't recommend you skip this book, though I could argue that you could, and it wouldn't change your experience with Oathbringer too much, but that's just my opinion. I think most Sanderson fans would disagree because Brandon Sanderson himself says that this is required reading, so he's the author of the book, so I would definitely recommend you read this one as well. Next up, Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. This is the first book I've read by Mr. Tremblay, and I had heard a lot of good things about him, particularly circling the book Head Full of Ghosts and this one. This one was the inspiration for last year's M. Night Shyamalan movie, Knock at the Cabin, a movie I mostly enjoyed, so I decided to pick this book up. 7-year-old Wen and her parents Eric and Andrew are vacationing at a remote cabin on a quiet New Hampshire lake. Their closest neighbors are more than 2 miles in either direction along a rutted dirt road. One afternoon, as Wen catches grasshoppers in the front yard, a stranger unexpectedly appears in the driveway. Leonard is the largest man Wen has ever seen, but he is young, friendly, and he wins her over almost instantly. Leonard and Wen talk and play until Leonard abruptly apologizes and tells Wen, "None of what's going to happen to you is your fault." 3 more strangers then arrive at the cabin, carrying unidentifiable, menacing objects. As Wen sprints inside to warn her parents, Leonard calls out, "Your dads won't let us in, Wen, but they have to. We need your help to save the world." Now this psychological horror thriller is at its core a home invasion story, with a single location being our setting, while what is presumed to be the end of the world, this apocalyptic backdrop outside, is seen within the walls of the cabin. The idea is great, and Paul Tremblay does a great job introducing the premise and gradually increasing the tension and suspense throughout, particularly throughout the first half of the book. Throughout, he brings into question what is the reality of the situation that they are in. It was very tense at many points, making it a largely effective horror read with prose that I really enjoyed. The cabin, even with the benefit of the morning's wholesome sunlight, appeared warm, tired and bereft. The paint on the door and trim is dulled and sun-bleached. The wooden shingles are blemished with dots of mildew and are loose and as asymmetrical as crooked teeth. The cabin is now a haunted house, baptized by yesterday's violence, and its passive accumulation of similarly vicious and desperate acts is as inevitable as dust gathering on the windowsills. Now, while I really enjoyed this novel, I didn't love it because of the various flashbacks and somewhat repetitive sections weighing the story down. The ultimate fate of one of the characters was certainly a bold move, that I just didn't really care for that much. I won't get into it because of spoilers, but it didn't feel well earned. It was certainly an emotionally poignant moment, but I feel like it didn't serve the story too well. Though it was certainly essential to progress the story how it did in the end, I just didn't feel like it was done effectively. So all in all, I enjoyed this. 3 stars, which is a good rating for me. I'm definitely excited to read more of Paul Tremblay because I think it's clear he's great at the craft, how he wrote suspense and dread. Maybe Head Full of Ghosts or his newest novel from this year, Horror Movie, might be my next read from him. But if you've read him, if you're a fan of Paul Tremblay, let me know what I should read next. Tell me in the comments. Next up, My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. I was really excited to read Stephen Graham Jones. In his Goodreads profile, it says that he's been called one of our most talented living writers by Tommy Orange. So I was sold because I've fallen in love with Orange's writing and storytelling ability. His debut, There, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and his latest, Wandering Stars, is a Booker Prize longlist this year. I'll get more into my love of Tommy Orange later because I actually just read Wandering Stars, so I'll tell you a bit more about that. But since he gave such high praise to Stephen Graham Jones, who seems to write exclusively horror, this praise coming from a literary fiction novelist, it excited me a lot, and I definitely was not disappointed. You won't find a more hardcore 80s slasher film fan than high school senior Jade Daniels. And you won't find a place less supportive of girls who wear torn t-shirts and too much eyeliner than Proof Rock, nestled 8,000 feet up a mountain in Idaho, alongside Indian Lake, home to both Camp Blood, site of a massacre 50 years ago. And as of this summer, Terra Nova, a second home celebrity Camelot being carved out of the National Forest. That's not the only thing that's getting carved up though. This, Jade knows, is the start of a slasher. But what kind? Who's wearing the mask? Jade's got an encyclopedic recall of every horror movie on the shelf. But will that help her survive? Can she get a final girl trained enough to stop all this from happening? Does she even want to? Isn't a slasher exactly what her hometown deserves? Now, as a big fan of slasher films, this book was so much fun. It seemed like the author's love letter to the slasher film genre. I think this book is really for horror nerds, the type of fans that could get a phone call from Ghostface Killer, like Cameron Diaz or Jenna Ortega in their respective films, but be the type of fan to not get fooled by his trick question on Friday the 13th. Now, while these type of fans would appreciate this book the most, our main character Jade ensures that the readers less knowledgeable of the horror genre are able to fill in the gaps in their horror knowledge through essays titled Slasher 101, strategically placed as the story progresses. These essays were some of my favorite part of the book and made me really love Jade as a character. They discussed everything from Agatha Christie mystery novels to Italian proto-slashers, a genre called giallo. But most interestingly, they meditated upon the character traits of a final girl, and how Jade did not feel like she's deserving or has the traits or background to be a final girl in her own story. From one of Jade's essays, to put in conclusion, sir, final girls are the vessels we keep all our hope in. Bad guys don't die by themselves, I mean. Sometimes they need the help in the form of a fury running at them, her mouth open in scream, her eyes white hot, her heart forever pure. Jade is a truly fascinating but tragic character. She's encountered abuse from her alcoholic father, and to me, I think a lot of the peculiarities that make her such a social outcast stem from this trauma. This book, in addition to being a well-written slasher, takes on themes of child abuse and alcoholism in Native American communities, the communities that Jade and Stephen Graham Jones both inhabit. I think these themes were tackled skillfully. I've been thinking a lot about this book since finishing it. And I am eager to continue because this is the first book in a slasher trilogy, with the final book being released earlier this year. Now, I'll admit some won't like the pacing of this book. Outside of the violent hook of the opening scene, it's largely a slow burn building up to the third act, which was bonkers. I will say logic is somewhat thrown outside the door at the end, but I loved it. The logic doesn't matter much in slasher films or slasher literature. You probably want to have a moderate to high tolerance for gore before picking up this book, because that ending really was something. The last few paragraphs wrapped up the story in a heartfelt and satisfying way. This was a 4-star read for me, and I highly recommend you pick it up if you love horror as much as I do. I'm planning to dive into Don't Fear the Reaper, the next book in this trilogy, next month or possibly in October. Our next book, Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson. This is book 3 of the Stormlight Archives. This one will be definitely tough to talk about without spoiling this or any of the preceding novels. So, a new storm has come. Ash and red lightning sweep the land, awakening our ancient enemies, the unmade, shadows of the enemy's soul. Stir while the eyes of men open. This war is not and never was what they thought it to be. We may soon hold surges again, for radiance has returned to some and shines towards others. The captain, broken by loss, seek reconciliation. The spy, broken by cruelty, seek completion. The stormwalker, broken by oaths, seek truth. The traitor, broken by ambition, seek freedom. And finally, the king, broken by war, he seeks the past, that which was abandoned, that which he must not know. For those secrets will crush him, as they did the knights who came before. Just like Way of Kings spotlighted the character Kaladin and Words of Radiance spotlighted Shallan, Oathbringer focused on our character Dalinar. Now, despite not enjoying Edgedancer much, the bar was still high coming into reading this because of how much I loved the first two and how much I enjoy being immersed into the world that Sanderson crafted and spend more time with these incredibly fleshed out characters. This book did so much to develop Dalinar's character. Through flashbacks, we really find out how despicable of a character he is and what kind of war criminal, warlord he was, and has always been implied to have been throughout the series. Now, I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion, but I leave this novel disliking Dalinar and what he's done, but appreciating the fact that they turned him into an imperfect, somewhat morally gray character, a very interesting character. It's refreshing in a series that was more and more seeming like all of our main point of views were heroes with perfectly tuned moral compasses. I'm excited to see Dalinar's story continue and see if he can achieve forgiveness and redemption from the readers like me, but also forgive himself. I loved this book, but some things I didn't care for much were the chapters taking on POVs of some of the auxiliary characters that were somewhat boring to me and took away from the momentum of the main storyline. Really making me feel the length of this beast right here. It's like roughly 1,300 pages. Also, without spoiling anything, some of Shallan's character arc and her developments maybe felt a little bit rushed to me and underdeveloped. Also, Adolin feels like a very flat character in this novel in particular. With how Words of Radiance ended, again, no spoilers, I would have thought that Adolin would be a big player in this book, but he was in the backseat for most part. There's no emotional development with him. He seems to respond to some pretty impactful events with emotional indifference and detachment. But I guess we see in Oathbringer how bad of a father Dalinar was for him, and maybe that can be used to properly flesh out this character in the future. Now, I sometimes think this book suffered a bit from middle book syndrome, but in reality, the expansion of the lore and politics, world building was masterfully done. And I think it'll pay off in the later books of the series. This was a great book in an exceptional series. This had a lot more action than the prior books, and like all his books, the climax was epic and memorable, really making me eager to pick the next book up. I gave this one 4 stars, and I highly recommend you read Stormlight if you are a fan of high epic fantasy. All right, next up, Margo's Got Money Troubles. There we are. By Rufy Thorpe. Now, was I expecting to love this much as I did? No. Was this funny, heartwarming, and thought-provoking read? Yes. It's a hard book to categorize, but I would consider it probably a comedic piece of literary fiction. Goodreads categorizes this, or one of the categories it puts it in is chick lit, which is a term I don't love. I understand why it exists. It is meant to market books to the target audience, predominantly women. But for me, I feel like there's a bit of inherent sexism to the term, and especially the type of books that they put under that moniker. I'm actually a bit surprised they still use that term. But this is a book I think people of any gender could love. I really enjoyed this as a man, so let's dig into it. As a child of a Hooters waitress and an ex-pro wrestler, Margo Millet always knew she'd have to make it on her own. So she enrolls at her local junior college, even though she can't imagine how she'll ever make a living. She's still figuring things out, and never planned to have an affair with her English professor. And while their affair is brief, it isn't brief enough to keep her from getting pregnant. Despite everyone's advice, she decides to keep the baby, mostly out of naivete and yearning for something bigger. Now at 20, Margo is alone with an infant, unemployed and on the verge of eviction. She needs cash infusion fast. When her estranged father, Jinx, shows up on her doorstep and asks to move in with her, she agrees in exchange for help with childcare. Then Margo begins to form a plan. She'll start an OnlyFans as an experiment. She soon finds herself adapting some of Jinx's advice from the world of wrestling, like how to craft a compelling character and make your audience fall in love with you. Before she knows it, she's turned into a runaway success. Could this be the answer to all of Margo's problems, or does internet fame come with a high price? This premise really only scratches the surface of what the story is all about, and the heart that it has. What I love most about this book is the characterization. I couldn't help but rooting for our main character, Margo, and her family throughout the messy relationship and struggles they have. She's put into difficult situations which she handles with strength and a good sense of humor. Her motivations are clear. She just wanted what's best for her baby. Because she's such a lovable character, you also want this for her. The similarities drawn between entertainers on OnlyFans and pro wrestlings is often hilarious, but also very deft observations. The novel certainly emphasizes with sex workers, particularly those that are single mothers, and give you a reason to empathize, not stigmatize such work. I also enjoyed how the story humanized those who solicit sex workers. They're not shown as gross pigs, but rather humans who are maybe lonely or seeking love or understanding that they haven't been able to get from elsewhere. This book is a story full of characters who have human needs and they struggle to fill. Love was not something I realized that came to you from the outside. I had always thought that love was supposed to come from other people, and somehow I was failing to catch the crumbs of it, failing to eat them, and I went around belly empty and desperate. I didn't know that love was supposed to come from within me, and that as long as I loved others, the strength and warmth of love would fill me and make me strong. So much is covered in this book, from drug addiction to stigma surrounding sex workers. This is a book that could have easily felt bloated, but Rufi Thorpe is such an amazing writer and did such an amazing job with this book. In addition to the breadth of themes within, the author also experimented with alternating between first and third person narration, which she did skillfully and intentionally. This could have felt clunky or purposeless, but it was seamlessly done. This was a great book. You should read it too. 4 stars for this book. Margo's got money. Next up, Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. I am a big fan of horror that incorporates space or aliens or general science fiction elements, so I was super excited for this one. It really scratched an itch for me. I was looking for a book like this. I was somewhat expecting this to mostly be a science fiction novel with some horror elements sprinkled in, but this was distinctly horror to me. I would say it falls under cosmic horror, and it was especially Lovecraftian in its final acts. That's how the madness of the world tries to colonize you, from the outside in, forcing you to live in its reality. The atmosphere of this was so eerie and unsettling, and throughout makes the reader question what is real and the sanity of our narrator. This book followed a group of scientists in a post-apocalyptic world trying to understand the unknowns of what they call Area X. Area X has been cut off from the rest of the world for decades. Nature has reclaimed the last vestiges of human civilization. The first expedition returned with report of a pristine Edenic landscape. The second expedition ended in mass suicide. The third in a hail of gunfire as its members turned on one another. The members of the 11th expedition returned as shadows of their former selves, and within weeks all had died of cancer. In Annihilation, the first volume of Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy, we joined the 12th expedition. The group is made up of 4 women, an anthropologist, a surveyor, a psychologist, the de facto leader, and our narrator, a biologist. Their mission is to map the terrain, record all observations of the surroundings and of one another, and above all, avoid being contaminated by Area X itself. They arrive expecting the unexpected, and Area X delivers, but it's the surprises that came across the border with them and the secrets the expedition members are keeping from one another that changed everything. This book won the prestigious Nebula Award for science fiction, and I absolutely annihilated this pretty short and incredibly weird novel in just a couple days because I couldn't put it down. Ambiguity made this such a strange and almost dreamlike read. You leave with more questions than answers, which could frustrate a lot of readers, and I know it does, but I personally love the open-endedness, especially since this is only the first book in a series. Vandermeer's writing is beautiful here and maintains an atmosphere of dread and suspense, and the concepts are mind-blowing. This was a 4.5-star read for me. I loved the experience. I definitely plan to read more Vandermeer. I'll probably continue with the series, so I understand it drops off in quality and popularity a bit, and that the horror elements are largely abandoned in the sequels, but with everything that was set up in this book, I really need to continue. I really need answers. I know there's a movie adaptation by Alex Garland, who directed Ex Machina and Civil War, which I've never seen, but I'm excited for it. He seems like a great director for this story. And finally, my favorite book of the month, Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. This book was absolutely incredible. As I mentioned earlier, I really fell in love with Tommy Orange's debut novel, There, and I think it was so worthy of the praise it received. He proved he was such a powerful writer with that piece. And with this book, I think he's just getting better. This book acts as both a prequel and a sequel to the events of There. Both cover many similar themes of generational trauma, addiction, and the horrors of American atrocities against its own people, but both are executed in distinctly different but equally powerful ways. There was a difficult read that takes an emotional toll on the reader. While There was rapidly paced, told from many point of views in short interwoven chapters, as their stories converge in its explosive yet tragic conclusion, Wandering Stars takes a slower pace and, as the title suggests, wanders. It's a quieter, loosely told set of stories. We are given a look at multiple generations of the Red Feathers family tree, and in ways appears to be a melancholy celebration of the history of the Native American people. Much of the story is told in a very fractured way, which I view to signify how the fractured history of Indigenous people have affected their sense of identity as characters try to understand their histories while keeping their eyes optimistically on the future. Colorado, 1864. Starr, a young survivor of the Sand Creek Massacre, is brought to the Fort Marion prison castle where he is forced to learn English and practice Christianity by Richard Henry Pratt, an evangelical prison guard who will go on to found the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, an institution dedicated to the eradication of Native history, culture, and identity. A generation later, Starr's son, Charles, is sent to the school, where he's brutalized by the man who was once his father's jailer. Under Pratt's harsh treatment, Charles clings to moments he shares with a young fellow student, Opal Viola, as the two envision a future away from the institutional violence that follows their bloodlines. In a novel that is by turns shattering and wondrous, Tommy Orange has conjured the ancestors of the family readers first fell in love with in There, warriors, drunks, outlaws, addicts, asking what it means to be the children and grandchildren of massacre. Wandering Stars is a novel about epigenetic and generational trauma that has the force and vision of a modern epic, an exceptionally powerful new book from one of the most exciting writers at work today, and soaring confirmation of Tommy Orange's monumental gift. Definitely agree with that last part about Tommy Orange's monumental gift. This was such a powerful book. As an enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribe, Tommy Orange masterfully interweaves real history of violence and erasure of indigenous people and culture, such as the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 and the forced assimilation programs of the late 19th century, with the heartfelt stories of his fictional characters. It is a story of survival and resilience, and is all told with truly incredible prose. The goal for me and my bandmates was always the same, to try and make musical loops that wouldn't sound or feel like loops because of the way they were built. That's the way out of a loop. Every day is a loop. Life tries the same as we try with music. Every day is the sun rising and the sun going down, and the sleep we must sleep. I even like sleep and dreaming now. Every day is life convincing us it's not a loop. Addiction is that way too. This book is both hopeful and tragic and tackles so many ideas and themes that I can't even begin to unpack in this brief review. So really, if you take anything from this video, pick up this book. This was a 5-star read for me and one of my favorite books in a long, long time. Okay, so that was everything I read this August. Thank you again for clicking on my video, and if you watched it to the end, you guys rock. And yeah, hopefully I'll have more content for you later this month, and then I'll hit you again with a wrap up for the month of September. Got a lot of exciting reads I'm looking forward to. Hopefully it'll be just as good of a reading month as this past one, because it was a lot of great reads. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.